The chamber was silent, its vast walls glimmering with cold, sterile blue light. In the center, a single figure stood, bound by heavy chains that sparkled with a faint, electrical hum. Jason Hayes, a human prisoner, faced the alien tribunal with his head held high, despite the oppressive weight of his situation. Before him, the 7 executioners of the Galactic Dominion regarded him with contempt. Commander Zorath, the leader of the executioners, stepped forward, his angular face framed by the shadows cast by his sharp, obsidian helmet. His species, the MRYTHS, were known for their merciless efficiency, their technology years ahead of humanity's. But it wasn't just technology that made the MRYTHS feared. It was their complete lack of empathy, their dispassionate approach to death. The tribunal was nothing more than a formality, a methodical ritual to eliminate those who dared defy the Dominion. Jason, though, did not look like a man on the brink of his demise. His eyes gleamed with an intensity that seemed to challenge the very air around him. His lips twitched in a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, and he held his ground as the weight of the executioner's gazes bore down on him. Jason Hayes, Zorath's voice was cold, echoing through the high ceilings. You stand before us condemned for crimes against the Dominion. Your defiance has been noted, and your sentence is final. What say you in your final moments? Jason's voice, when it came, was quiet but unwavering. I say you've underestimated us. Every time. Zorath's eyes narrowed, but his face betrayed no emotion. Every time? You speak of what you do not understand, human. Jason's gaze didn't waver. You call yourselves executioners. You're nothing more than a cowardly pack of hounds, following orders, obeying those too weak to think for themselves. Laughter rippled through the tribunal. The 6 other executioners, their alien features grotesque in their mirth, made no attempt to stifle the mocking sounds. They hadn't seen this kind of defiance in ages, not from a human. Not from any prisoner, for that matter. A species that, for all its resilience, was still fundamentally weak in the eyes of the galaxy's elite. Zorath raised a hand, signaling the laughter to subside. You speak of defiance, human. And yet, here you are. Your defeat is assured. Jason's eyes flicked toward the observation deck above them, where members of the galactic elite watched the proceedings through a glass shield. His gaze, however, was not one of fear or even pride. It was a gaze filled with a silent, deadly promise. The kind of promise that could only be made by someone who had witnessed the impossible before and made it possible. You know nothing about me, Jason said, his voice sharp now, cutting through the room like a blade. I'm not just some prisoner. I'm not just some human. He leaned forward slightly, his chains clinking in the silence, as if to make sure Zorath heard him clearly. My name is a legend. You'll see. The commander's brow furrowed, the corners of his lips curling into a slight sneer. You think that your name holds weight here? That it matters? The name of a single human, one man among billions, has no place in the annals of history. Your legend is nothing more than a hollow tale meant to comfort the weak. But Jason's eyes never left his. You're wrong, Zorath. My name is the thing that changed the galaxy. It's the thing that terrifies you. He spoke the words with such cold certainty that even the most hardened members of the tribunal couldn't ignore the ripple of unease that passed through the room. Zorath's fingers twitched. He wasn't used to being challenged in this manner, certainly not by a prisoner who should have long been broken by his circumstances. The commander's eyes darted to the side, to his second-in-command, Carrick, a hulking figure of yellow scales and sharp teeth. Is this true? Zorath's voice was almost a whisper now, his command of the room slipping. Carrick hesitated, then nodded slowly. I've heard of him. In the old reports. He led the humans in the Defiance battle. He's the one who, Carrick's words trailed off as if the weight of the memory was too much for him to speak aloud. Jason's smirk deepened at the reaction. The Defiance battle was a legend, one that had been etched into the history of the galaxy and was whispered in fear by species who had once thought humanity weak. It had been a single human, Jason Hayes, who had outsmarted and outlasted a coalition of dozens of alien species in a desperate bid to save his people. A battle that had, against all odds, turned the tide of the war. Zoratha's eyes flicked back to Jason, his posture stiffening. "You dare to speak of that?" he growled, his voice low but filled with venom. "The humans were defeated. Your so-called victory was nothing more than a temporary respite." Jason's gaze didn't falter. "Maybe. But you can't erase what happened, can you? You can't forget it. You can't unsee what I did." His voice grew louder, his confidence growing with every word. "And now, I'm standing here, facing you. You thought this would be the end of me. But you're wrong." The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. Zoratha's breath hitched for the briefest of moments, his mind racing to piece together the significance of Jason's words. Had they truly captured someone as dangerous as this? Jason's defiance was no longer just bravado, it was the legacy of every human who had fought, bled, and died for their freedom. And now, in this sterile, impersonal chamber, he was about to show them just how dangerous one human could be. He took a deep breath, his voice low and steady. "Do you really think you've won, Zorath?" He leaned forward. "You've heard of me. You know my name." For the first time, the smug confidence in Zoratha's eyes wavered. Jason smiled. "Then you know, you've already lost." The chamber's atmosphere grew heavier as Jason Hayes' defiant words lingered in the air. The executioners, now silent, exchanged uncertain glances. It was clear they had not expected this response from a mere human. But it wasn't just his words that unsettled them, it was his calmness. In the face of death, Jason stood unbroken, his confidence unnerving. Commander Zoratha's glowing blue eyes narrowed beneath the dark ridges of his helmet. He could feel it, too. The name. That name. Jason Hayes. The whisper had reached all corners of the galaxy, even to the most distant systems where the MRYTHS had never tread. But to see the man himself, standing there, bound and ready to face his fate, was an entirely different matter. "You are that human," Zorath said, voice steady but with a hint of something else beneath the surface. "The one who led the last stand against the Zorak coalition. The one who defied us all and lived to tell the tale." Jason's lips curled slightly, an almost imperceptible smirk that flickered like a flame ready to spark. "I've been called worse things." The room fell into an eerie silence. Zorath, his mind racing, took a step back. The Zorak coalition had been an unstoppable force, until a human, this human, had shattered their alliance. The victory had been so improbable, so impossible, that it became a legend. A tale passed from one star system to another, until even the highest echelons of the Dominion had heard of it. "You think your name makes you invincible?" Zorath asked, the question venomous. "You are nothing but a prisoner, about to be executed like any other." Jason's expression softened, his gaze unwavering. "You know better than that. You know who I am." Zorath clenched his fists, the faint hum of his energy gauntlets filling the space. He'd been part of the forces that had witnessed Jason's rebellion firsthand. The man had led his ragtag human army against forces 5 times his number, outwitting, outplaying, and outlasting them until they'd been forced to retreat. It was a defeat that still haunted the Dominion's war archives. "This is different," Zorath said, more to himself than to Jason. "You will die here, Hayes. There will be no retreat, no clever trickery to save you." Jason's eyes flickered, the sharpness of his intellect obvious in the way he sized up the situation. "You don't get it, do you? It's not about tricks. It never was. It's about what happens when humans are pushed too far." Zorath paused, a fleeting moment of doubt creeping into his calculated mind. His gaze shifted to the other executioners, who stood in rigid formation, awaiting their leader's command. None of them seemed to share the same unease. To them, Jason Hayes was merely a defiant human, one who would soon be erased from history. But Zorath couldn't shake the feeling. Something was off. "What is your plan, human?" Zorath asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and scorn. "Do you truly believe that your name, your legacy, can spare you from death? You are alone, surrounded by enemies, your strength is gone. There will be no second chance. Jason's voice was a whisper, but the room seemed to lean in, as if waiting for his next words. You don't understand. My name isn't what makes me dangerous. It's what's been passed down through every human who's ever fought for survival. We don't know how to quit. We never have. Zorath blinked, taken aback by the simplicity, the quiet strength behind Jason's words. He had expected arrogance, a desperate plea, or perhaps some final burst of energy. But Jason Hayes wasn't pleading. He wasn't even begging for his life. There was only calm certainty. Enough, Zorath growled. He gestured to the other executioners. Execute him now. As the order was given, the heavy chains binding Jason began to hum, and the executioners advanced. Their weapons, sleek, alien, and deadly, glowed with energy, their sharpened tips reflecting the dim light of the chamber. But Jason didn't flinch. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on Zorath, unwavering. The executioners raised their weapons in unison. But just before they struck, Jason did something that no one expected. He smiled. It wasn't a grin of triumph or defiance, but a knowing smile. Zorath's eyes widened, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of his blade. What was this human planning? What had he seen? What? Before the executioners could move, the ground beneath them trembled. A low hum began to vibrate through the very walls of the chamber, the noise rising to a piercing crescendo. The lights flickered. The walls shimmered, distorting for a moment as if the very fabric of space had been stretched. And then, the sky above the chamber, visible through the translucent dome, darkened. A massive ship, unlike anything the MRYTHS had ever seen, descended from the heavens. Its shape was jagged and organic, unlike the sleek, cold ships of the Dominion. It was a human ship, and it moved with the fury of a beast unleashed. Zorath's heart skipped a beat. The Dominion had no record of this ship. No intelligence had forewarned them of its existence. But the insignia, the human insignia, was unmistakable. Impossible, Zorath muttered, stepping backward. Jason didn't move. He only whispered, "You think you've won, but you haven't even begun to see what we're capable of." The chamber shook violently as the ship hovered just outside the dome. The MRYTHS, who had once thought their reign of power was absolute, now found themselves face to face with something they had never anticipated, a force that could, and would, defy them. As the ground continued to rumble, Zorath knew one thing for certain. The game had changed. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken, the electric hum of the glowing chains wrapping around Jason's wrists growing louder, as if the walls themselves were listening. His words had struck something deep within Zorath, something far beyond the realm of simple defiance. The MRYTH commander's gaze faltered, ever so briefly, before the cold exterior snapped back into place. Zorath had fought wars. He had seen countless species rise and fall. Yet, there was something about this human, a resilience, a spark of unyielding will, that unnerved him. How could someone so small, in comparison, hold such power? It wasn't the strength of his body, certainly. It was the strength of his mind. And that was something Zorath had yet to understand. Enough, Zorath growled, snapping his fingers to silence the muttered conversation among the other executioners. Prepare the chamber. Jason's eyes never left Zorath, the tension between them palpable. He knew what was coming next. He'd seen it all before. In the deepest recesses of his memories, the image of his fallen comrades, the ones he could never save, played over and over. The guilt weighed heavily, but it fueled his defiance. There was nothing that could break him now. The other executioners moved with methodical precision, their actions as practiced as they were brutal. One by one, they activated the containment fields around the chamber, the hum of power thrumming like the beat of an ominous drum. The temperature in the room dropped, a chilling reminder of what awaited him. This was the final stage, the moment where they would erase his existence, turn him into nothing more than a footnote in the vast history of galactic conquests. Jason, however, felt something shift. It wasn't the cold. It wasn't the ever-present weight of death hanging in the air. It was the realization that these executioners, no matter how many times they had carried out such duties, had never encountered a human like him. Not once. As the last of the executioners, a hulking creature with 6 limbs and eyes that seemed to multiply as they flicked about the room, approached the center of the chamber, Jason's lips curled into a slight smile. "You still don't get it," he muttered, just loud enough for Zorath to hear. "You're about to make the biggest mistake of your lives." Zorath's posture stiffened. "What do you mean by that?" Before Jason could respond, a harsh light pierced the chamber, and a heavy metallic door slid open, allowing a figure to step inside. His silhouette was sharp, outlined by the harsh glow from behind. It wasn't an executioner. It was someone else, someone important. The figure removed its hood slowly, revealing its face. A human. A woman, with the same steely resolve in her eyes that Jason had seen countless times before. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and the sharp lines of her face seemed to carve through the air itself. "Commander Zorath," she said, her voice cold but confident. "I'm here to deliver the judgment." Zorath's eyebrows shot up, clearly surprised. The tribunal had not authorized any outside interference, let alone the arrival of a human. "Who are you?" Zorath demanded, his voice a mixture of confusion and irritation. The woman's gaze shifted toward Jason, and a glimmer of recognition passed between them. "I am Captain Mara Quinn, formerly of the United Human Front." She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Zorath's, unflinching. "And this man, Jason Hayes, is not your prisoner to execute." Zorath bristled, his hands instinctively hovering near his weapons. "The tribunal has already sentenced him. His execution is non-negotiable." Mara didn't flinch. "Your tribunal is misguided. Jason Hayes is a hero of humanity. And his death would ignite a war you're not prepared for." There was a moment of silence, one that stretched between the two species like a vast chasm. Jason's heart beat faster, not out of fear, but recognition. Mara. She was one of the few who had survived the assault on the Zorak coalition with him. They had fought together, bled together, and now, she had come to his defense once more. Zorath's voice broke the silence, harsh and biting. "War? You think your species can challenge the might of the Dominion? You, who are so fragile, so easily broken." Mara's smile was small but full of something fierce. "You underestimate us. That's been your mistake from the start." Jason's gaze shifted between the two, watching the confrontation unfold with a calmness that bordered on eerie. He had been in these situations before, facing overwhelming odds with only his mind and his will to guide him. And now, with Mara here, it seemed the scales had tipped ever so slightly in his favor. "The Dominion," Mara continued, her voice steady, "has already made one mistake by taking him prisoner. But if you kill him, you will make an even greater one." Zorath's hand twitched, his fingers flexing in anticipation. He could feel the tension crackling in the air, thick as the hum of the containment fields. His people, the MRYTHS, thrived on logic, on power. But this human was an anomaly. A wild card. And in his mind, that made him dangerous. Jason spoke, his voice sharp as ever. "You've been warned. This is your last chance to walk away. Choose wisely, Commander." Zorath's cold gaze fixed on Jason, a glimmer of something, perhaps doubt, perhaps recognition, flickering beneath the surface. "You may have brought reinforcements, human. But in the end, it will not matter." The tension reached its peak, and for the briefest of moments, everything seemed to still. Then, with a snap of Zorath's fingers, the ground beneath them rumbled. The countdown to Jason's execution had begun. The real fight was just beginning. Jason stood unmoving, his eyes locked on the woman who had entered the chamber. The moment she revealed herself, his heart stuttered, a brief moment of confusion that quickly shifted into something colder. The woman was familiar. In a galaxy filled with faces that were all too often distant, she was one he had never thought he would see again. Her name was Kara Graves. The very mention of her name had once sent ripples through his mind, like a stone thrown into the stillest of waters. They had fought together, side by side, during the war against the Zorak coalition. They had been allies, comrades, until a single, catastrophic betrayal had torn them apart. But standing before him now, he saw only the hardness of someone who had chosen survival over sentiment. Zoratha's voice cut through the silence, low and threatening. "Explain yourself, human." Kara's sharp, calculating eyes moved from Zorath to Jason, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment too long. There was a flicker of something in her expression, something Jason couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity. It wasn't remorse. It was a quiet understanding, one that cut through all the walls of time and betrayal between them. "I'm not here to explain myself," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made even Zorath pause. "I'm here to make sure that he doesn't die today." The words were met with a moment of stunned silence. Jason's brow furrowed. She's here to save me? That was impossible. The last time he'd seen her, she'd walked away from him without a word, without looking back. "You don't belong here," Jason's voice was low, a quiet accusation. He hadn't expected her to show up, not like this. Not at all. But he wasn't the same man who had watched her leave all those years ago. He wasn't the same man who had been willing to follow her into hell and back. This time, he wasn't sure where her loyalties lay. Kara's face softened imperceptibly. "I'm not here because of you, Hayes. I'm here because of what's about to happen to the rest of us." Zorath sneered. "Enough games. Explain why you've come now, or I will consider you an enemy of the Dominion." Kara didn't flinch at his threat. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice growing colder as she met Zoratha's gaze. "You really have no idea, do you? The humanity you've been underestimating for so long is more than just a few war bands or some weak, fractured rebellion. You've been fighting the wrong battle." Jason's stomach clenched. There was something in her words, a tension, an unspoken warning, that unsettled him. Something bigger was happening than he had realized. Kara wasn't here just to save him. She had an agenda, one that ran deeper than any betrayal or alliance they had shared. Zorath laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that bounced off the cold walls of the chamber. "You are all so predictable. Humans. You never know when to stop." Kara's eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous in her pupils. "It's not us who need to stop, Zorath. It's you." Jason didn't move, but his pulse quickened as the tension in the room escalated. What Kara had just said, it didn't make sense. He had always thought of the Dominion as a monolith, unstoppable, cruel, and indifferent to the whims of a single species. He had thought that the executioners, Zorath included, were the very definition of that power. But now, there was a different kind of weight hanging in the air. A realization. Something was coming. Something bigger than either of them. For a split second, Kara's expression softened, just long enough for Jason to catch the flicker of emotion in her eyes. "There's more going on here than either of us can control. And we both know it." The words felt like a slap in the face. Jason had always prided himself on understanding the larger picture, on seeing the threads that tied the galaxy together. But now, with Kara standing in front of him, he felt like a fool. He had been so caught up in his personal vendetta, in his need to prove something to the Dominion, that he had lost sight of the bigger fight. "You're right," Jason said, his voice low but firm. "But that doesn't mean I'm just going to let you pull me out of this. You can't save me. Not this time." Kara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to face Zorath, her eyes narrowed in a way that spoke of more than just the physical confrontation between them. She was playing a longer game, one Jason couldn't quite see yet. Zorath, sensing the shift, stepped forward. "Enough," he said, his tone now laced with fury. "You humans will not undermine us any longer. This farce ends now." Before anyone could react, the chamber's lights flickered once and then went out entirely. In an instant, the room was plunged into darkness. A low, mechanical hum vibrated through the floor, followed by a sharp, high-pitched tone that rattled the walls. Jason's heart raced as his body tensed, his senses flaring to life in the eerie quiet. "What is this?" Zoratha's voice rang out in confusion. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed from every corner of the chamber, chilling the air like a cold gust of wind. "The time for underestimating humanity is over, Zorath." Jason's pulse surged in recognition, a sinking feeling forming in his gut. The voice wasn't human. It was something else. Something powerful. The darkness stretched on, and for the first time, Jason realized that the true fight wasn't just between him and Zorath. It was something much larger, something that neither side had expected.